Welcome everyone. This month I'm going to be talking a little bit about the practice of what we might loosely call visualization in both our asana, our movement practices, as well as pranayama, our breathwork practices, and then also a little bit about how we can use visualization in our meditation practice. But starting with the asana practice, how do we deepen our practice is often a question that gets asked. And of course, just to recap, many of us may already be familiar with this, but just to recap that when we are practicing asana, that is when we are practicing the movements of yoga, the third limb of yoga, it's essential that when we are moving, we are paying attention mindfully to the sensations and the way it feels to move. In addition to that, we are paying attention to our breath and in some ways regulating or modulating the breath so that the breath flows in union, in conjunction with our movement. And then of course implicit in all of that is that our mind is fully engaged in the practice. That means our mind is fully engaged with the sensations of movement and also with the activity of the breath. And Krishnamacharya often used to say, as did his son Desikachar, that we're not really practicing asana if we don't have those three things together. And that in and of itself is a complex practice which takes a lot of time to be able to actually start an asana, to begin and end, having fully connected all of those three things for the duration of that particular movement or vinyasa sequence. But there is actually more that we can add into our practice to increase the potency and the power of the practice. And I don't mean the power physically, but I mean the power in relation to how we can use our practice to transform our mind. So by connecting the mind into the breath, by connecting the mind into the body and noticing those sensations, what we are essentially doing at one level is cultivating a mind that can be one-pointed. It's a state of what we might call ekagrata, which is basically that the mind can stay connected into and around an object for a reasonable period of time. And what that does is it starts to create a samskara, a pattern, a new pattern in the mind, which takes us from a more distracted, multifocal mind to a more concentrated, one-pointed mind. And as many of you know, this is really at the absolute essence or the foundation of all yoga practice, is beginning to be able to train our minds to stay focused in one place. There are many, many reasons for this, but one of the reasons is that when our mind is focused, we begin to see things more clearly. And as we begin to see things more clearly and accept things more clearly as they are, this slowly starts to bring about a transformation towards stillness in the mind. It starts to bring about a transformation of not needing to jump from one thing to another and allowing our mind to rest peacefully in one place. But that is also why if we start to bring in what we might loosely call visualization, or what is known in Sanskrit as bhavana, into our practice, we can start to increase the benefits of our practice even more. So for example, one of the things that's been cued in classes in recent weeks in my studio sessions in London has been to connect yourself to a place or a time in your life where you felt very, very peaceful. So to use a visualization of bringing a feeling of peace into the body, into the breath, into the mind, as we are actually practicing. So as we move, we start to see if we can hold on to that connection to that visualization, whilst also retaining the awareness of what we are doing in the moment, which is why it's a slightly more advanced practice than just focusing on the breath or focusing on sensation. Because what that means is that it allows us to practice within a container that allows us this moment of peace in the practice. So we are visualizing and trying to connect to a peaceful state, and then practicing our asana from the context or from the place of that peaceful state, which then not only means that we are developing a one-pointedness in our mind and in our attention, but we are also familiarizing our body, our breath, our minds with what it actually feels like to be peaceful in the moment. And then gradually over time, what happens is that we can let go of what we might call the furniture of the memory, so the specific circumstances of the memory that helped us to cultivate peace. And we can just start to begin going directly into the felt experience of peace within our asana practice. Now, one of the reasons that this particular visualization or memory practice of bringing back a memory of having felt peace at a previous time is so powerful and so interesting in our asana practice is because what it helps us to realize is almost to bring about this juxtaposition between how we normally feel when we practice and what it feels like to attempt to cultivate peace when we are practicing. And at first, what we might notice is that actually we're carrying quite a lot of tension in our practice. We are carrying a feeling of achievement or needing to achieve or needing to strive or needing to push, which as qualities in and of themselves are kind of not in the same direction or not in the same energy flow as bringing peace to body, mind, and breath. So when we start to visualize and start to bring about and cultivate a feeling of shanti, a feeling of peace within ourselves, we can begin to notice that actually perhaps our previous practices were not necessarily taking us in that direction of peace. And again, we must remind ourselves time and time again that the purpose of asana is not exercise. Yes, there are physiological benefits to practicing, but it is the first step, we might say, in bringing our minds inwards and beginning to cultivate a state of one-pointedness, which ultimately leads to mental stillness, which then ultimately leads to peace. So by visualizing peace in our practice, we start to allow the breath and the body and the mind to reflect that peace and practice in a way that guides us more towards peace rather than agitation. I'd really love to encourage everyone watching this video to try this when they practice. And even if it's a pranayama or a breath practice or a meditation practice, to just see if you can connect to a time or a place where you felt peace and let that be the focus of your practice, to see if you can sit with and then gradually allow that feeling of peace to arise more and more naturally. Because of course, all of our practices are merely tools and techniques to get us to a certain place. And that is to say, in this context, at a certain point in our practice, we can even let go of the visualization or the feeling of needing to cultivate a peaceful state because we've become so one-pointed that we just drop our attention inwards, allow everything to open up and expand in that moment. And we naturally will find ourselves moving unaided through the benefit of the practice that we have previously done into a state of peace. And this is another important point. I think it was Swami Vivekananda that famously said, it's wonderful to be born into a church or born in a church, but it's not so great to die in a church. And what essentially he was saying, he wasn't speaking badly of other religions or anything like that. What he was basically saying is that the church is the practice, essentially. So we can be born into a practice, into a spiritual tradition, but ultimately the tradition is there to help us transcend the binding of the technique and the binding of the ideas, because ultimately our peace and the transcendence that we are perhaps looking towards in the future or perhaps now lies beyond all of those techniques in a space which is free, flowing, and peaceful. So please do see if you can bring some of this practice into your own personal practice, or even when you're next in the studio, regardless of what is being cued, see if you can intentionally set out in your practice to cultivate peace and see how you get on. So thanks as always for listening. I hope that you found this video useful, and I look forward to seeing you again very soon. Namaste.